Security is one of the most important human values. We want to feel secure in our daily lives, but security is also a national and global matter. What if one is starting to affect the other? Good evening, my name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the war in Gaza, security has become one of the top headlines in our information spaces. Us versus them narratives are being used to target our vulnerabilities, making us feel insecure. Putin, for example, has been very successful at combining attacks on strategic targets in Ukraine with influence operations in Western countries. And with the situation in the world as it is today, it's hard to feel secure. Today, we'll examine the enormous impact disinformation has on our sense of security. When Elon Musk tweets about you and accuses you of sweeping censorship targeting right-wing voters, it might mean you're on your way to doing something good. And when we talk about security, it all starts with the experts that build strategies and find new responses to unresolved problems. Our next guest is one of them.
Pablo Bruer, Cybersecurity and Information Technology Executive. Pablo Bruer is an executive at a publicly traded Fortune 50 company. A 22-year veteran of the Navy, Pablo's tours included top-level positions at U.S. Special Operations Command Donovan Group, SOFWERX, the NSA, U.S. Cyber Command, and U.S. Naval Forces Central Command. He's a co-founder of the Cognitive Security Collaborative and co-author of the Disinformation Analysis and Response Measures Framework, the methodology used by the US and EU governments and NATO to address misinformation and disinformation.
Pablo, thank you so much for joining us today, straight from DC. It's an important topic that we are going to be discussing. It's our security. And disinformation is something that is very much working to influence our security as well. You were working with the topic for years, exactly on the cybersecurity. That's where your expertise lie on. And when was the time when you actually realized that disinformation is something that is so dangerous?
Yeah, Maya, thanks for having me. I have always thought that all cyberspace operations really have some amount of disinformation because you need a user to click on something and then you need them to take action or not take action based upon things that you're changing in the computer system. But after the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, I realized that this was no longer going to be the domain of nation states during time of active conflict, but it was something that we were really starting to see very openly during times of relative peace. So about 2016, I decided that I needed to take another look at this, and in 2017 hosted an event with several experts while I was still at U.S. Special Operations Command. And then my dear friend Sarah Jane Terp and I decided that we would start working on this and develop a framework so that researchers and practitioners could share threat information on disinformation incidents.
So you realize that actually what is important is to have a proper cooperation in between different institutions, organizations, and people that are researching what is happening in the information space, correct?
Yes, absolutely. This is not a problem that's going to be solved by one community. I know that there are a lot of people out there that are saying, well, this is a problem in social media, and so the technologists should take care of it. But that is not going to be sufficient. It's really going to be a whole of society issue. It's going to take sociologists and technologists and lawyers and governments. And we all use very different languages. And so we needed some sort of communication method so that when one group tried to communicate something, every other group knew exactly what they meant.
And if you look at the malign actors, that's what they are doing. So they are much more contained together and speaking one language?
No, they're not contained together, but they're all aware of the operation. One of the challenges that defenders, and defenders is really everybody that's not on offense is that they're not aware that they're being manipulated. The people that are carrying out these attacks have planned out the attacks. Everybody knows what's going on. Everybody understands what the mission objective is. Everybody understands what the messages and narratives are that they're going to be pushing. The rest of us just sort of see things and say, well, was this a mistake or is somebody behind it? And we need to communicate that with other members of society so that they can lend their expertise, lend their perspective, so we can decide if this is something that was intentional or merely an accident. And we need to have a common language in order to be able to do that.
And how different cybersecurity approaches can support in this? I'm thinking about ISACs, for example, so information sharing analysis centers, right, as coming from the US. We are right now using it quite heavily in the EU as well.
Yes, no. So again, we need to be able to share threat intelligence so that as somebody sees something that may be an attack or maybe a threat, they can share with the larger community, so everybody can start paying attention, ears up and eyes up to see if they see indications of an attack, and so that they can be ready to respond to disinformation narratives and make sure that we properly inform people of what's actually going on, what's truth, because a lot of these narratives can be very damaging. They can lead to physical harm. They can lead to psychological harm. They can lead to all sorts of nasty things. And ISACs are there to protect the populace. So the outstanding questions with the ISACs is typically ISACs are looking at one particular sector. So they're maybe looking at the energy sector, or maybe they're looking at the medical sector. And so an open question that I think the community at large has is, do we need an ISAC specifically for disinformation, or do we want to put a disinformation desk at each of the existing ISACs? And I know that that's something that the EU is looking at. I know that's something that the US is looking at. And so that still remains an open question.
How they can support actually also in the crises, right? Now you're having the hurricane times in US. How that affects our security, and how also ISACs, for example, other approaches can support in this?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, we just had two really horrific hurricanes, two once-in-a-year or once-in-a-lifetime storms within a couple of weeks in Florida in the United States. And what we've seen is a large number of disinformation narratives about the relief efforts that are being conducted by the government, and whether or not they're being properly funded, and if where the money is coming from and where the money might be going to. And so that leads to a lot of civil unrest. Just yesterday, we had an incident where armed militias in Florida, I believe, were challenging Federal Emergency Management Agency personnel that were trying to give aid to local citizens. Now, not only is that dangerous for the federal agents, but that means that those agents weren't able to give aid to the citizens that really needed the aid. That could lead to death, disease, all sorts of other things. More fundamentally, in the longer term, it leads to an undermining of the trust that citizens have in their government. And when citizens no longer trust their government, those governments tend to have significant issues, not just protests, but eventually revolutions and collapse.
So it's basically looking at what's happening in the space, in the cybersecurity, but also talking with elections. Right now you're having elections in the US and the campaign, so trust in the government is a part also of decision-making process of people's going to vote, right?
It is. And the reason that cybersecurity is involved at all really these days is because most of the message transmission, most of the narratives are communicated via computer networks and via social networks. And so the cybersecurity industry and the cybersecurity community already has sensors in place. They already have communication channels in place to share threat information, except now instead of just looking at viruses and looking at malware, now they're also looking at harmful narratives, and they're making sure that everybody knows that these harmful narratives are out there and getting the message out before long-term harms can be done. But yes, it's we're seeing large-scale narratives, disinformation narratives surrounding relief efforts. We're seeing large-scale disinformation narratives surrounding illegal immigration. We're seeing large-scale disinformation narratives surrounding all of the major talking points and all of the major concerns for the U.S. presidential election.
Pablo, thank you so much for showing all of the cybersecurity approach and possibility also to counter disinformation in this way. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Maya.
Now, let's take a deep dive into the US presidential campaign.
Please welcome the next president of the United States, President Donald J. Trump.
And I'm proud to be an American.
Who are the main disinformation actors in these elections?
There are malign actors on all platforms. X, Facebook, all social media probably has malign actors. There are actors by our adversaries, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, are probably involved in efforts, and they are doing it in an intrepid manner through these different social media platforms. According to the Department of Justice, there has been an effort to, in fact, disrupt and create a malign influence on U.S. elections. The Trump campaign announced that they were hacked or interfered with by the Iranians. That's highly possible, but I would suggest, I mean, not only suggest, I would assert that in this election, of the 2024 election, one of the biggest purveyor of disinformation is Donald Trump himself.
It's been a terrible response from the White House. They're missing $1 billion that was used for another purpose.
It is certainly disinformation because the governors in these states, they have said they have gotten complete support from FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that there's been an immediate response, and that even newspapers in North Carolina, for example, the Charlotte Observer, ran a staff editorial and put it on the front page and said, what Trump is doing is false and stop hurting North Carolinians. He is trying to depress voters from going out to vote. He and his party, which is referred to as MAGA, have sought to discredit standard voting procedures in America, including mail-in ballots, ballots that can be dropped off into drop boxes by people who vote. Mr. Trump, according to him, these are not secure ballots. There is no evidence to that assertion.
So let's show our appreciation for their unbelievable service to our country.
I do believe there's going to be an effort to cast doubt on those who vote in North Carolina when the landscape has been completely torn up. Houses have been destroyed. Roads are washed out. Bridges are gone. I mean, people have lost everything. And so I do believe there will be efforts to, in fact, say, well, how could they vote? Plan B by Mr. Trump and his acolytes is to disrupt the election after the election has concluded. And that is very clear.
We have to win this election. If we don't win this election, there's tremendous consequence for everything.
Today's malign actors have taken to heart the Roman rule of divide and conquer. They understand that when you go up against a strong opponent, you need to break the bonds that hold him together. In these insecure times, do the EU and NATO still stand united? And how do disinformation and foreign influence undermine that unity and our global security? We'll find out with our next guest.
Dominica Haidu, Policy Director and Program Manager at GlobeSec. Dominica Haidu works at the Central European think tank GlobeSec, where she leads the Center for Democracy and Resilience, which aims to defend democracies against subversive efforts designed to undermine them. She focuses on analyzing information manipulation and its impact on democratic societies, the intersection of technology and democracy, and strategic communication.
Dominica, thank you so much for joining us today at the episode talking about security and disinformation. And while we're talking about national security and global security perspective that I'm going to be asking you about, first I would like to refer to our personal security, because if we are talking about disinformation, it very often affects our feeling of willingness of being secure, right?
Absolutely. We could already see this a couple of years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the disinformation about vaccines, about pandemic itself, about the virus, have really caused a threat to personal security, personal health, and in some cases even caused death because people weren't taking precautionary measures or weren't getting vaccinated. But there are also other instances where disinformation affected people's behavior, where they threatened their own security or the security of their neighbors, their closest ones.
Can you give some examples of this affections of people attitudes or behaviors, like especially if they were going to vaccine or not? That was you referred to, or?
Absolutely, that is one of the cases. If people didn't get the vaccine, which could have saved their life, and they got sick or even might have been worst implications. But for example, there are other cases where disinformation about, for example, LGBTI+ people, community, have caused real physical attacks on the streets, on the members of this community. We had 2 years ago, actually, we had the terrorist attack that happened in Slovakia on 2 members of the LGBTI+ community that were killed, which was caused by hate speech and disinformation about the community shared online. Another example could be in a very peculiar case of an elderly man, a 70-year-old man in Czech Republic, who derailed 2 passenger trains because he believed that the trains were carrying migrants and that the migrants were flooding the country. At that time, the migration-related disinformation was spreading very widely, and this actually cost him his own freedom. Of course, there were no migrants in the train, there were regular passengers, and luckily no one got hurt, but he was actually sentenced to jail on the grounds of terrorism.
And that's exactly where we're going into the national security, right? Because it's hate speech and disinformation that can affect one attitude of a person. It can affect the national security itself, right? And you were having in Slovakia as well attempt of murder of the prime minister, for example.
Absolutely. We can see that the disinformation is changing behavior in many respects. It is also causing greater aggressiveness in the society. It is not only in Slovakia, but also in other countries across Europe and the US, where we are seeing increasing attacks on political representatives. This is being caused by disinformation and polarization, which is being fueled in the information space. And indeed, we just earlier this year in May, we had an assassination attempt on the Prime Minister, Robert Fico, who was in critical condition in hospital. And this attack, so far, we believe that this was an attack of a person who was acting on his own, on behalf of his own decision, but was very much fueled by the polarized atmosphere in the society, and which is being also fueled by disinformation, attacking different groups of the society, as I mentioned in the case of the LGBTI plus community, in case of migrants. Some are spreading disinformation or hate against other groups such as liberals, some against conservatives. So on different grounds, there's a lot of disinformation being spread, but it is threatening national security, but it's because it is threatening unity and cooperation within the society, right? The mutual trust is one of the core pillars of a well-functioning democracy. And if the democracies and people in themselves do not trust each other, it sort of undermines the core building blocks of it.
And that's basically the goal of the malign actors, for example, Russia, that are active in Europe, very much to destabilize and polarize the societies. So it's undermine the national security, but it's also about national, international, and global security. And we have in here EU and NATO, and how we can move this into the supranational level.
Yes, so absolutely. One of the core tactics of the malign actors, especially in our space, Central and Eastern European space, it's Russian or the Kremlin's goals, is to undermine EU and NATO's stability and unity. And to put it very simply, if we are and they are doing it through dividing us, right? Through making divisions among the different countries. And if we are divided, again, if we are not united, if we are not acting as a united front with united policies towards our partners or towards the actors who are threatening us, it is undermining our own security. So just to give you a very specific example here, Russia is lobbying heavily across policymakers and through disinformation to make the EU alleviate sanctions, right? But the sanctions are in place because of its aggression on our neighbors. And if we alleviate sanctions, Russia will be able to boost its economy and even more and freely fund its war efforts against maybe other European countries, other neighbors. Kremlin is also aiming to undermine our support to Ukraine, but if we undermine it, it is a clear security gain for the Kremlin. And if they make more war gains, it is again a security threat to NATO due to potential war zone proximity or encouragement that they can attack another country without our others coming to help.
So disinformation is a security matter, and I think that's something that is very much established. You are talking about that in GlobSec as well. But what EU and NATO and other institutions together can do to actually counter disinformation in terms of the security? You have a few sentences on this, but it's an important question.
Absolutely. EU and NATO can do something because, I mean, there is a strength in unity and in cooperation that we still have in many respects. So on the institutional level, there are already bodies that are analyzing information influence, disinformation, and also hybrid threats more broadly. So also the adoption of other tools beyond disinformation, such as cyber attacks or the use of spies or the recruitment of, for example, extremist groups or far-right extremists who are analyzing these threats on a more umbrella scale, which really helps us to see the level of threat and also the interconnections between different states, which is very important because, as we know, disinformation or information influence doesn't respect national borders. It can be transnational, and it is often transnational in the sense of.
Thank you so much, Dominika, and thank you for emphasizing that holistic approach and unity is crucial. We can only make it together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, let's summarize what national security means.
What is national security and how do us versus them narratives spread disinformation? National security is the protection of a country from attacks or other international threats using both military and non-military means. It involves addressing a wide range of threats, including military, economic, energy, environmental, and political risks. Malicious actors often exploit national security narratives such as us versus them to spread disinformation, targeting citizens' vulnerabilities to create fear and insecurity.
We are stronger together. Unity is the foundation of security. It's hard to feel secure amid the crisis in our world today, but it's worth trying. Don't forget that one of the main goals of disinformation is to instill fear in us. Next week, we'll look at what scientists are doing to better understand the cognitive processes exploited by disinformation. Until then, keep calm and think deeply.